Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sam Moulton from the Business Review, and I will be your host. It's our pleasure to have George Clinical, the Nucleus Network, and NPR Group with us today, who will be discussing why conduct early and late stage research in Australia. Today's guest speakers are Bev Thomas, Chief Executive Officer at the Nucleus Network, who will be discussing early phase research, Mark Peskis, Director, NPR Group, who will be discussing R&D tax incentives, and Marissa Peterson, Managing Director, George Clinical, who will be discussing mid-late phase research. I'd like to welcome you to our new webinar platform on 24. You'll notice that this webinar is browser-based, so if you disconnect, please click the link you've received via email to rejoin. In order to ask questions, you can send them in via the Q&A widget, which is at the bottom of your screen, or use the questions box at the top left-hand corner of your screen. We'll then allocate around 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the session to address any questions or thoughts you may have. If you click on the green resource list widget, you can view or download PDFs uploaded by our speakers and also view a video. And if you click on the yellow help widget, that will give you any assistance should you require it. So without further ado, please allow me to welcome Bev. Bev, over to you.
Thank you, Sam. My name is Bev Thomas. I'm going to give you an insight into early phase clinical research in Australia. Australia has long been a main destination for a large number of international big pharma and biotech for early phase clinical trials. One of the main attractions for selecting Australia for early phase trials is the regulatory framework for approval of such trials. In Australia, there are two pathways for clinical trial approval. The one used by the large majority of studies, including first-in-human trials, is the Clinical Trial Notification Scheme. This involves the approval of the trial by the local IRB and subsequent notification to the Australian regulatory agency, the Therapeutic Goods Administration. The agency does not review or evaluate the submission documents, and there is no agency approval. The second pathway is called the Clinical Trial Exemption Scheme, the CTX scheme, and in our experience, this has been limited to genetically modified organism products. And in this instance, the TGA reviews a comprehensive dossier that comprises the CMC, preclinical efficacy and toxicology data, and the trial is approved under a specified usage criteria. 99% of early phase studies in Australia are conducted under the CTN scheme, and the benefits of the scheme are summarized in the slide here. It's really that there is no a review by the TGA, and that it is just a notification process, and the approval to conduct the study is provided by the local IRB. The approval by the IRB provides a license for the supply of the investigational product for use in the clinical trial. The TGA provides an acknowledgement, which usually occurs within 1 week of the notification. The documents that support this process for IRB approval are limited to the protocol, the investigator's brochure, and the patient information consent form. So there's no comprehensive dossier to prepare, which is in contrast to jurisdictions like the US and Europe. Furthermore, startup timelines are typically very rapid. Within about 3 to 4 weeks of submission to the IRB, you can gain approval, and up to 10 days to then receive the CTN acknowledgement. In our experience, this is a very attractive prospect for many overseas sponsors, and these timelines are the same regardless of the study design, from first in human through all the other types of early phase studies. In contrast to many other jurisdictions, Australian clinical research units work with local and global CROs to deliver full service support for their clinical trials. The Australian early stage environment is supported by accomplished clinical investigators and researchers, many of which have extensive international experience. They've had a long history of expertise across all early-stage clinical trial designs, including first-in-human, food effect-drug interaction, ADME, thorough QTC, and now increasingly we're seeing more and more adaptive protocols that include a combination of both healthy volunteers and cohorts of patients. Some Australian clinical research units conduct up to 40 studies a year, and many of these conduct up to 10 first-in-human studies every year. So from a quality perspective, Australian CRUs have a strong history in this respect, working with fully developed quality management systems. At Nucleus Network, our quality system is designed to support all aspects of trial realization. We have a full suite of SOPs and policies that define all aspects of clinical research to support the conduct of the trials. There's a formal learning and development program for all staff which helps to enforce the ongoing compliance with global GCP requirements. And all staff activities have a strong focus on subject safety and data integrity. The quality system has been subject to audits by the FDA and Anvisa, the Brazilian regulatory authority, and is routinely interrogated during sponsor audits. Another main attraction to overseas sponsors is the Australian pharmacy requirements for Phase 1 clinical trial material. So Australia follows the same principles as the US 2008 guidance on the manufacture of Phase 1 trial materials, which means that the manufacture itself is exempt from the requirement to be conducted in a CGMP licensed facility. The process must still follow GMP principles, but allows for smaller batches to be manufactured outside of a CGMP licensed facility. Additionally, there isn't only a requirement for a QP person, as in Europe. For our first-in-human studies, we find that when we're routinely looking at rapid dose escalation, a number of our sponsors are now electing to compound their finished product just in time for dosing, often using the preclinical formulation. This allows more flexibility on dose selection at this early stage of the clinical development. And it also allows the sponsor to expedite their path into the clinic, as they'll only require long-term stability on the API rather than the dosing formulation, which will only require the short-term stability data to support its use from the just-in-time compounding to dosing within the trial environment. Units in Australia also have a full range of support services for study execution. At Nucleus, we have 4 full-time clinical pharmacists on site who oversee all the IP management and any compounding requirements, while any aseptic preparation is conducted by the local hospital clinical trials pharmacy. We also have radio pharmacy capabilities available, as well as small-scale secondary packaging services. Additional support services include clinical testing. There's an extensive list of clinical assessments available to support the study conduct. In addition to the standard list that you'd expect to see, a number of study-specific assessments have also been sourced, often through working with physicians from different departments at the local hospital, particularly for therapeutic areas such as cardiovascular, respiratory, neurology, pain, and allergy. So we work with clinicians from the local tertiary teaching hospital to bring assessments on site to support any study-specific requirements. From a technical perspective, we're also supported by technical laboratory services co-located with the clinical research unit. These perform the standard PK and PD sample processing, storage and shipping, as well as such procedures as PBMC isolations, time-critical cytokine stimulation assays, biopsy management, and in-house drug screens. Participant recruitment, which is obviously critical at all stages in clinical research, is supported by a full-time recruitment team, that they maintain the healthy volunteer and patient population database, which is constantly being updated. Our healthy volunteer database has more than 15,000 active participants, and the patient database has recent updates for infectious diseases such as hepatitis C and B, psoriasis, as well as specialist populations such as immune thrombocytopenia, post-herpetic neuralgia, interstitial pulmonary fibrosis, Japanese and Chinese healthy volunteers for ethnopharmacology studies, and pharmacogenomic status for various CYP450 enzymes such as 2D6, 2C9, and 2C19 that identify extensive and poor metabolizer status. We also work closely with patient advocacy groups in a number of different therapeutic areas to help support recruitment. So in summary, I guess Australia provides a range of advantages as a destination for early phase clinical research, including an expedited study startup, which uses routinely the CTN scheme, experienced clinical investigators in the early phase research space, access to a broad range of support services, phase 1 clinical trials IP manufacturing requirements that can often help to expedite timelines, all staff being trained in GCP, and a highly maintained quality management system to support a high level of subject safety and high level of source data integrity. I'd now like to hand over to Mark Peskett, Director of NPR Group, who will provide an insight into the local R&D tax incentives.
Thanks, Bev. So for the next 15 minutes, I'm just going to provide a high-level overview of the R&D tax incentive program, how it works, the key eligibility criteria, the level of incentives, and how it applies to foreign companies conducting research in this country. The R&D tax program in various forms has been in place for over 20 years, and it is the government's flagship program to encourage R&D in Australia. The current R&D tax incentive program was introduced in 2012. Under the program, there are two types of incentives. There's a refundable tax offset and there's a non-refundable offset. Both of these offsets are claimed through the tax system when you file the annual tax return for the entity. With a refundable offset, it's at 43.5%, and it applies if the group turnover of the entity is less than 20 million, and that includes worldwide income, and tax-exempt entities own less than 50%. So in this scenario here, if you're eligible for the refundable tax offset, for every dollar you spend in R&D, you'll get 43.5 cents back. That'll first go to meet any tax payable by the entity, but if there's no tax payable, you get the full amount as a cash refund, which you can do with what you like. Under the non-refundable tax offset, that's at 38.5%, and that applies where the group turnover is 20 million or more, or tax-exempt entities own 50% or more. So the tax offset in this circumstance just reduces the tax payable of the entity, and any unused tax credit is carried forward. I just want to touch on the eligibility criteria. There's three sort of major components. First of all, you have to be an eligible R&D entity. You have to carry on eligible R&D activities, and the minimum level of R&D expenditure must be at least 20,000. Once you're over that mark, though, you can claim the incentive on the full amount. So eligible entities, the Australian company, so an incorporated company here in Australia, or it can be a foreign company which is an Australian resident for tax purposes, or a non-resident but it's domiciled in a country which Australia has a double tax agreement with. and it operates in Australia under a permanent establishment, which is generally just a branch office. Generally, we would recommend that you set up an Australian company to conduct your R&D activities here. It's easy, it's simple, and it's the most effective way. One of the other key rules is what's called the own behalf rule. Essentially, this means that the entity claiming the R&D incentive must control the R&D project, bear the financial risk of that project, and own the results of the R&D project, and be able to commercialise those results. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail later. The exception of this rule, though, is that where the Australian entity acts as a subcontractor for a related foreign tax resident, which is domiciled in a country where we have a double tax agreement with, and it can still claim the R&D offset here, but the benefit is significantly reduced. So it comes down from 43.5 to around 12 to 15% due to transfer pricing rules, and I'll show an example of that later. So what are eligible R&D activities? Well, there's two key components. There's core activity and there's supporting activity. These activities must be conducted in Australia or can be conducted overseas, but you need advance approval, and the overseas expenditure can't be any more than the Australian expenditure. And the activities must be conducted for the benefit of the entity claiming the incentive, unless that exception applies that I just talked about on the previous slide. So I'll just give some examples of some of the activities. So core activities are really the crux of the R&D program. They're basically the experiment that you conduct, and they're carried out using the scientific basis and method. From a biotech point of view, early stage biotech point of view, they would cover, the preclinical and toxicology activities, phase 1, 2, and 3, and maybe a little bit of phase 4. Manufacturing, where it's novel or high risk, could be a core activity in its own right. Supporting activities, I've got a list there. It includes clinical trial site selection, manufacturing where it's routine, patent searches, post-trial monitoring, project planning, documentation, regulation, submissions, etc. There are some exclusions to supporting activities, and they're basically marketing-related activities and a few others. But where you're solely carrying out R&D, so that's all you're doing, I think most of the activities will qualify as core or supporting. So what is eligible R&D expenditure? Because it's what you claim the offset on. Well, it's basically the expenditure that's related to the eligible registered R&D activities. And it includes things like salary and wages, contractors, travel, overheads, rent of facilities, depreciation of plant and equipment, etc. Just your normal P&L expenses. There are some exclusions, and one of those is finance costs, so interest, etc. on any loans to fund the R&D will not be eligible. But basically, once again, if the entity, if that's all it's doing is R&D, then most of the expenditure would be eligible R&D expenses. So I just want to touch on now for overseas companies some key structuring issues that need to be considered. So if you're thinking about coming to Australia to conduct your R&D, there's some commercial and tax issues that need to be thought about. One of those is the ownership of IP resulting from R&D in Australia. So there's two options that I'll go through in terms of structuring. One is where the IP is owned by the Australian entity, and the other one where it's not. And I'm not talking about total IP, I'm just talking about the IP that arises from the R&D project in Australia. This affects the level of cash incentive, It also needs to fit in with your commercialisation strategy and objectives, and you also need to consider the exit options. So if Australia does own some IP and you either sell the total IP or license it out, how do you deal with the Australian structure from an exit point of view? So I can't cover off all those issues because a lot of those relate to specific circumstances, but more than happy to discuss those with you if you need to sort of set up a time to do that. So I'll just cover off on the two key structures. Structure one is where the Australian entity owns the IP from R&D in Australia, and this is where we can maximise the refundable tax offset. So under this scenario, the foreign parent owns 100% of the Australian sub, and it's funded that by equity or loan. The Australian sub conducts the R&D. It spends money in Australia. It could be contract Australian CRO and can even incur some overseas expenditure provided they meet the guidelines. Under this scenario, though, the Australian sub must own and be able to commercialise the results coming out from that R&D project. Doesn't mean it has to own all the background IP or any future IP. It's just the IP arising from the R&D activities in Australia. So under that scenario, the Australian entity would lodge its tax return and claim the R&D incentive. And from a numbers point of view, this is how this would look. So if we assume an R&D spend of $1 million, worldwide group turnover is less than 20, so eligible for the refundable tax offset, so eligible for a cash rebate. So the $1 million spend, we have a $1 million loss. From a tax point of view, we add back the R&D spend just to work out what the taxable income is before R&D. In this case, there's none, so there's no tax payable. So in this case, the company would be eligible for a refund of $435,000, which is 43.5% of $1 million. It would lodge its tax return and receive a cheque for that amount. The interesting thing, though, is that if that refund is reinvested into further R&D, the total incentive realised is 62.42%. So over a 2-year period, if you invest $1 million, you could potentially get back, just over $624,000, which by world standards is very generous. The other structure is where the foreign parent owns the IP. So in this case, and this is one of the exceptions to the own behalf rule, the foreign parent owns the Australian sub again, and it basically contracts the Australian sub to conduct the Australian R&D activities. Then under transfer pricing rules, the Australian sub would need to invoice for the R&D services back to the foreign parent, and that's usually a cost plus a markup, which we're saying about 10%. And the Australian entity would just claim the Australian R&D activities. It wouldn't be able to claim any overseas activities. It would lodge its tax return, and as you'll see from the next slide, the net cash benefit is a lot less. It's around just above 12% on this scenario. So once again, we assume the R&D spend is $1 million. Worldwide group turnover is less than 20. In this case, we have accounting loss. We have the add back the national R&D spend. We have the charge for R&D services, which is cost plus 10%. So we have taxable income of $1.1 million. We have net tax payable on that of $313,500. We're eligible for the refundable offset. So once again, 43.5 of a million. So we claim back 435, but we have to pay that tax of 313,500. So the net cash benefit is 121,500, which is just above 12%. So it's still attractive, and it gets around the issue of ownership of IP here. But most of the companies that we've been acting for from the US that have set up here, they've all gone scenario one, where they structure up an Australian entity which owns the IP here in Australia. I just want to briefly touch on overseas activities. As I said, if you set up the Australian entity to carry on the R&D for its own benefit and it owns the IP coming out of that R&D project, it can claim costs for overseas activities as part of that project. So if you wanted a larger population, you needed to go overseas, the Australian entity could do that here. First of all, to be eligible to do that, it needs to lodge an application and get an advance finding and approval, and the overseas activities must be eligible activities, so either as core or supporting and have a link back to the Australian activities. And you have to show that the activities could not be conducted in Australia due to several reasons, facilities, expertise, equipment, etc. Population or geographical, you just need a geographical spread for your trials. And the other key important thing is that the total expend on eligible overseas activities has to be equal to or less than the total spend on Australian activities. So in other words, the overseas expenditure can't be any more than 50% of the total expenditure on the R&D project. But it can be quite attractive claiming that in your R&D tax incentive. I just want to finish off by quickly just touching on some of the compliance obligations. To set up here, Australian entity or a branch office, we'd need to get tax file number, Australian business number, we'd need to register for various taxes. If it's a company, you'd need to appoint at least one director, and at least one director has to be an Australian resident. Or if it's a branch office, you need an Australian sort of local representative here, and appoint a public officer for tax purposes. We lodge the Australian income tax return. The Australian tax year is from 1st July to 30th of June, and that's where you claim the incentive through that. You can change that year to align with the year which you operate with, so to align with the foreign parent, that's okay, we'll be able to do that. And just finally, just before I hand over, is the application process. So if there's any findings you need to approve the overseas expenditure, or you can get an advance finding just to make sure your project is eligible, we lodge that with a government body called AusIndustry. Then we conduct the R&D activities, and within 10 months after the end of the financial year, we have to register that R&D project and the activities with AusIndustry. They approve that and send back a registration number. We fill out the R&D schedule in the income tax return for the entity, include that registration number, lodge a tax return, and then probably in a couple of months after lodging the return, you'll get your cash back. That's all I wanted to cover off. We do have a flyer in the folder there, which you can download. I'm going to hand over now to Marissa Peterson. Marissa is the MD of Managing Director of George Clinical, and she's going to talk about mid-late phase research in Australia.
Hello everybody, good morning, good evening, wherever you happen to be. It's a pleasure to be able to take part in this webinar and perhaps shift gear a little bit and take us into later phases of research. Bev and Mark have given you some good insights into why Australia is a good destination for early phase research, phase 1 in particular, both from a clinical perspective but also from a business and financial perspective. So Australia is a country where obviously we can take phase 1 into phase 2 very easily, but I really want to talk more about later phase research and the benefits of working in Australia, but also the benefits of leading research from Australia in this late phase area. So first of all, what am I talking about with late phase research? Well, really talking about studies that require large numbers of patients and large numbers of sites. And often these need to be conducted across multiple countries and often multiple regions. And they're long studies. They're looking at efficacy and safety as most clinical trials are, But increasingly there is a focus on gathering what is commonly termed real-world data, or data from real-world usage, and also pharmacoeconomic data. This has become an increased focus of regulators who will approve drugs for use on the proviso that these large outcomes-focused studies are conducted. And we're also finding that it's an increasing interest of pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies to gather this sort of data so that they can better assess their market as well as the efficacy and safety of their product in a more generalised population. So these are studies that should be designed in a way to facilitate data collection that is simple and streamlined to obviously control costs as well. So given that these are large studies, I want to introduce Asia for consideration here. Australia as a leader, but Asia as a very good destination for these sorts of studies, because really there are a decreasing number of late phase trials being conducted in Australia, largely because of population limitations. So this graph, which has a lot of data in it, really sets out the data from clinicaltrials.gov for all phase 3 trials that were registered on that clinical trial registry between 2007 to 2012. So each set of bars per country takes you through from 2007 on the left to 2012. And you can see that the countries where there is a growth in these later phase studies are primarily Japan, China, Korea, and it's also steady in Hong Kong and Singapore, which are obviously much smaller countries, but are also very strong places to conduct late phase research. India is also, we believe, on the rebound, and whilst this graph is showing the number of trials decreasing, many of you will know the recent legislative changes are making that again a good destination for late phase research. Australia, however, on the far right, you can see a drop-off in these studies over the last few years, and I'll talk a little bit about why that's the case. But having said that, there are some very good reasons to undertake late phase trials in Australia as well as in the region, and these are detailed on this slide. So we have very high quality research facilities and infrastructure. ICH GCP was introduced here in the late 90s, but Australia itself had one of the early codes of good clinical trial practice, or good clinical research practice as it was known then, from 1991. As a result, there's a strong workforce here, a highly skilled workforce in clinical trials management, many of whom have experience across the region, given our location. As Bev has mentioned, the efficient regulatory approval continues through all phases of the studies, and the CTN scheme, or the notification scheme, means that we have a 7-day period for notification to the regulatory agency, compared to very long regulatory processes in some countries, most notably China. Our ethics approval process is being simplified. It is state-based at the moment. However, there is a harmonised process for ethics approval across the nation now, and that's really starting to move trials through in a more simplified manner through to approval, which is a very good thing. Our participants in trials are generally located in a few large cities. So whilst we're only 22, 23 million in Australia, which is very small compared to the huge countries around us, the patients are centred around the major cities, and generally the major cities of the eastern seaboard. We have a Western, obviously, healthcare environment, so very comparable to the US and Europe. And of course, the investment incentives that Mark has identified are available, but are probably, to be fair, less applicable to the later phase projects. But it's this very high calibre of research that sets Australia aside as a leader in this region for late phase research. And we're just going to move into a couple of polls, which I'd encourage you to take part in. So we'd really welcome your view on which country out of China, Australia, India and Japan you believe has the highest output of scientific papers. Now, Sam, would you like to explain the process for registering your polls?
Thank you. So, yeah, it's very simple. You just click on the little circle next to the relevant answer, then click Submit. While everyone's voting, I just want to remind the attendees you can start submitting your questions now for the Q&A section at the end. It'd be good if we had a good few of those in before we got going. So you just type those in the top left-hand corner of your screen in the white box there, then press Submit. That'll submit the question. In terms of the poll, have you got any comments about this question, why you wanted to ask it today?
Well, I'm interested to hear people's views on where they believe the scientific papers are being generated from in this region, and we can perhaps discuss that with a little bit of data further on. Sure.
So you've had a good opportunity to vote now, so I'll move over to the results slide and display those. So as you can see, Australia has the most votes there with 53.6. If you just want to comment on those results, we'll then move on to the second question.
Yeah, so I think you might be a little bit surprised when I give you the some data around these. In fact, China followed by India have China followed by Japan have the highest numbers of scientific papers being published in the Scopus database of journals.
Okay, that's interesting. I'll move on to the second poll question now, which is, which country has the highest citations per author? And the answers again are A, China, B, Australia, C, India, or D, Japan. And again, Marissa, if you could just comment on this while we allow the audience to vote.
So this question is obviously slightly different, and the importance here is to really differentiate, I guess, between the number of publications and the impact of those publications in the journals.
Okay, thank you very much. So, yeah, again, hopefully the attendees, you've all submitted your votes by now, and we'll move on to the results page. And again, Australia has the most votes with 50%. So if you could just comment on those before carrying on with your presentation.
Yeah. So in this case, I think the audience is very in tune. Australia indeed does have the highest number of citations out of this grouping of countries, which I think is a reflection of the strength of research that I mentioned. Clearly, some of the very large countries like China and Japan do publish very large numbers of papers, but as you can see from the right-hand graph here, this is an index of the impact of publications from journals, and is based around the numbers of citations of those journals. And you can see that Australia, whilst clearly lower than the United States, is ahead of India, China, and in fact South Korea is the other country that's included in this graph. The left-hand graph actually refers to the numbers of citations, and whilst it may be difficult to read, again, the other Asian countries are actually to the left of Australia, which is indicated by the arrow here, and the United States is across on the right. So Australia does produce very high quality of research. We have a very good researcher base. People say we punched above our weight. We have a higher number of Nobel laureates in the sciences and medicine per capita I believe, than most other countries in the world. So moving along, other aspects about the Australian research environment that make it very attractive is the government's commitment to building research capacity. And this bar chart is from the NHMRC, which is our funding body in Australia, indicating the contribution over the years from 2003 to 2012 of funding to create new knowledge, to build capacity, and in translational research. And this has steadily grown, although it would be very nice if we could maintain the 2008 levels. It's also important to note that Australia is a very collaborative research environment. This is really important given our location, given our population, but also given the need for collaboration to really generate the best science. And you can see here that this graph is attempting to show the number of documents or journal articles, and again this is from the Schemago or Scopus database of journals and publications. Australia has a much greater number, 40% of its papers have more than one country represented in the authors, compared with levels around about 15 to 25% for the other countries, including the United States, interestingly, that are also publishing. So just summarising there, Australia has very good researchers, they are well funded, and they work very collaborative with other groups around the world. It's a good base for clinical trials as a result. However, we do have a small population, and I mentioned that previously. And we also have a relatively high cost in Australia compared to many of the emerging countries and emerging regions where costs are contained in clinical trials. And this comes down to labour costs largely, as well as the costs of procedures in clinical trials. So this is something that troubles Australian researchers a great deal, and there are efforts to make sure we do remain competitive, but it is a very good reason for looking at the broader region. So this map just depicts the region. Half the world's population is in these countries between India and Japan, with Australia in the south there. So coming across from India through China, Japan, down through Indonesia is the fourth most populous country in the world, and of course Australia down further to the south. So whilst we may not be able to contribute the numbers to clinical trials, certainly our colleagues in Asia can. We are natural leaders in this regard because of our experience in clinical research and also our time zone being essentially the same time zone as most of Asia. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this slide. Really, I think we've talked about most of it. Clinical trials, and particularly large late-phase clinical trials, need to go where the patients are. Asia-Pac is a region that can provide a high diversity of patients. You do need to understand, when you're working in Asia, the idiosyncrasies of different countries, the different local regulations, languages, and cultural differences between the various countries. And this is something that Australia has a great deal of experience in working with. As I said, most of my colleagues in Australia have been working in Asia for 15 to 20 years running clinical trials. So some of the challenges of running clinical trials in Asia, there is a great need to understand the regulatory requirements, which differ obviously country by country. There is a great deal of difference in site requirements in terms of contracting, and this is often driven by the hospital and the ethics committee, as in other places. And we find that there needs to be a level of flexibility in head office legal groups in understanding the differences in those needs in Asia. The cultural understanding is key, and site networks need strong scientific leadership as well as greater support by CRAs and project managers perhaps than in traditional clinical research countries or the more Western countries. It's important to have a locally experienced CRO or affiliate staff who can work effectively with the sites and understand the differences in terms of hierarchy and cultural norms. However, there are great dividends if the appropriate support structures are in place. Not only is there the opportunity to enrol a large number of patients, but the data quality, as identified by the FDA in particular, has published on this extensively. The data quality is very good and is acceptable to FDA and EMEA, provided there is evidence of GCP requirements being implemented. So no different to anywhere else. I wanted to show you a couple of quick examples of studies that George Clinical has conducted in the region and the impact of this region on recruitment of patients and retention of patients. This is the ADVANCE study, which was an 11,000 patient study in a diabetic population. And these patients were recruited, 11,000 patients, over 16 months. It was a global study, but the important thing on this graph is to look at the two graph lines that start around June, July 2002, which take off almost vertically. These are India and China, and they obviously contributed strongly. More than 50% of the patients came from Asia, and India and China recruited their patients, which was 3,500 patients in 6 months. The ADVANCE study has gone on to have a second cohort called ADVANCE On, and actually the results of that study are being presented this week at the European Society of Cardiology in Barcelona. Patient retention is just as important as patient recruitment, particularly in these large late-phase trials. And this is data from the SHARP study, which has been published in about 2010. Again, a diabetes study, this time in a renal outcomes population. And you can see that the top two lines there are the Asia-Pacific line in hot pink and the China line in blue, which had the highest retention rates. So they not only recruited very well, but they retained the patients over a 4-year period. So in summary, Australia is a great place to do late-phase research, but it has limitations. But Australia is a natural leader in late-phase research across the Asia-Pacific region. We can bring our expertise in design and leadership as well as delivery of clinical trials. We have an excellent pool of researchers and an increasing pool of excellent researchers in Asia. And we have the long-standing experience in international collaborations to work on global studies, contributing from the Asia-Pacific region. So with that, I can hand back to Sam, who will look after the Q&A session. I hope you have questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marissa, and to Mark and Bev as well. So you've got several questions in from the audience. I think it's about 2 each at the moment, so I'll just start running through those. We're going to go to Bev first, and the first question we've got in, if you're ready, is What are the requirements for import of IMP, test, generic and reference from EU to Australia?
Thanks, Sam. So typically, a specific import permit isn't required for clinical trial material, with the exception of materials that are subject to some restrictions, such as products containing substances that are listed as prohibited, so generally opiates, drugs of abuse, or drugs with abuse potential, and any materials of biological origin. But apart from that, no specific import permit is required, and really it relies on the CTN acknowledgement and approval form, which provides the importer with the license to bring the material into the country.
Great, thank you very much. We'll move on to a question for Mark now, and its first question is, what is best resource to find out more details about the Australian R&D tax program?
Thanks, Sam. Well, there's a number of resources, but if you went to the government site, so Oz Industry, you would find some fact sheets and guides around the R&D tax incentive program, and there is a guide for biotechs, industry guide. So if you just Googled that, we have a PDF brochure as well that they can download from your site, which provides some more details. But the government site, Oz Industry or the Australian Tax Office, would be the best resource to look at.
Great, thank you very much. So yeah, just a reminder to the attendees, if you click on the green resource widget at the bottom there, that's where there's a few PDFs there. You can open those up and download them and keep those after the webinar's finished. Next question now is for Marissa, and that is, how does other countries in Asia Pac perceive Australia? Wouldn't they prefer leadership from within?
Yeah, interesting question. In fact, the countries in Asia, whilst very proud of their own achievements and what they can contribute to clinical trials, really want to work on global studies, and they are very willing to accept leadership and guidance from Australia and actually from all Western countries. They like to work in English, and they really see the opportunity to build their skills through being part of multi-country studies. They don't seem to have any issues with leadership from Australia, and in fact, there's a great deal of focus amongst the CRAs and PMs who are very keen to do their qualifications from Australian universities. It's seen as a leader in that role as well.
Great, thank you very much. We'll move back over to Bev. We've got another question for you, which is, what is the acceptability of Australian-generated data by other regulatory agencies?
Thanks, Sam. I think as the audience probably heard throughout the presentation, both from Marissa and myself, then they'll understand that the quality of clinical research in Australia is very high and of a similar standard to what you would expect to see in the main jurisdictions in the US and Europe. And the acceptability of data is really on a par with data generated in those environments, often supporting submissions in the US and in Europe. So very widely accepted that the quality is of an international standard.
Thank you very much. So we've got another question in for Marissa now, and that is, does George Clinical support med device trials? If yes, can you provide a brief response on how the statistics/regulations presented vary?
Short answer, yes. George Clinical does support medical device trials, and through the George Institute and its cardiovascular division has been quite involved in interventional cardiology and the devices associated there. In terms of the regulations, I think all countries in the region, like the rest of the world, are increasing their requirements for clinical trials or clinical data to be collected, clinical effectiveness of devices. It does differ country to country. I can't really give a blanket response on that, but I'd be really happy to give you more information if you'd like to contact me, and the contact details are in the resources area.
Great, thank you very much. We'll go back to Mark now for the next question, and that is from your experience working with US companies, is the rebate from the Australian tax incentive considered taxable by the US IRS?
Short answer, no, because the rebate will belong to the Australian entity and be subject to the Australian tax system, and the rebate is not taxable in Australia. So it's exempt income here in Australia. So it's not the US entity that receives it, it's the Australian entity.
Okay, thank you very much. And we'll go back to Marissa again now. This question is, George Clinical looks like they have an office in India. What's the situation there now?
Yes, I think I alluded to this in my presentation. The Indian regulations have been revised and are now very much in line with international standards. The new regulations make clinical trials in India more robust and stronger. The problem there over the last 18 months has been that there was a requirement for compensation for patients with injuries from clinical trials that went beyond the normal clinical trial related injuries. That has now been changed. So the safety reporting, safety compensation is now equivalent to the rest of the world, and they have improved their oversight and vigilance of sites and ethics committees, which I think is going to improve trials there going forward. So I really look forward to the number of trials going into India increasing again, and we're already seeing evidence of that from large pharma who are fairly quickly going back to take a good look at putting their trials there.
Great, thank you very much. And I think it's our final question from Mark now, which is, if my particular division does not have a presence in Australia, but my parent organisation does, would we be eligible for the R&D tax incentive?
Well, the R&D needs to be conducted by an Australian entity. So if the parent organisation conducted it, because it had an entity here in Australia, it would be eligible. But if a particular division wanted to do it, it would need to set up an Australian entity to conduct the R&D here.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got one last question, which is some people asking for a copy of the presentation. If you're viewing this as a live view, it will be available on the on-demand version from tomorrow, or if it's on demand, it will be included in the resource list there, just a PDF of today's slides. Apart from that, I just want to ask any of the speakers if you've got any final thoughts before I wrap up today's presentation.
No, I'd just like to thank everybody for their interest in conducting trials in Australia.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So that just leaves me to thank Marissa, Bev and Mark for what was a great presentation. Thanks to George Clinical, Nucleus Network and MPR Group for sponsoring this session. To the attendees, you'll receive an email shortly telling you how you can access the on-demand version of this webinar, or you can find a link to this on our website, which is www.business-review-webinars.com. That'll be there shortly. We look forward to sharing further webinars with you, so please do keep an eye out on the website just mentioned. Follow us on Twitter, which is @BRWebinars, or join our LinkedIn group, Business Review Webinars. And yeah, just thank you all once again, and I hope you all have a nice day.